a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new. A man who's old enough to know and young enough to do. Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Kennedy, 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 for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy,
If you care anything about American politics, chances are you were tuned in on June 27th, 2024 for the first 2024 presidential debate. And if you were anything like me, then you were fairly terrified by what you saw. Watching two geriatric men walk out to no audience like WWE during the pandemic was already entertainment enough for me. But then I was forced to be subjected to all that followed.
Eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with.
And finally, after watching 90 minutes of embellishment and old man groans, I found myself wondering, why do we even have these anymore? Obviously, it's barely for any sort of educational reason, or the moderators of the debates would feel obligated to intervene when the competitors blatantly lie to their audience or go off on unrelated tangents about their IQ scores. So what is it about these exhibitions that brings over 50 million Americans back to cable for one night every 4 years? Why do the outcomes of these showcases prove so pivotal for presidential candidates? To unravel it all, I believe we have to take a trip back to every tradwife's favorite era to see where the notoriety of the presidential debate actually began. This is you. You are a middle-class American with a middle-class house and a middle-class family in the year 1960. On September 26th, you and your family gather in front of your brand new 21-inch Hoffman TV to watch this, the first ever televised presidential debate. About 87% of American households had a television at the time that the first debate was aired. This event would prove to be a decisive indicator in television's role in American politics for the next 60 years. Let's introduce our contenders here. On our left, we have Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy, young, handsome, Catholic, and son of mega-millionaire politician Joseph Kennedy Sr. Due to the status of his family, JFK swept through the primaries with relative ease, but his political reputation was barely a contributing factor in his appeal. JFK had the allure of a Is that how you say that?
Allure.
Allure? JFK had the allure of a young celebrity. He was a Purple Heart recipient, a Pulitzer Prize winner for a book that he probably didn't write. He was a cultured enthusiast of art and music, and he had a personal stylist and a 60s sex appeal that fascinated young voters and mothers alike. Kennedy was a picture-perfect politician, and had a team around him that consistently kept this narrative alive. And to our right is incumbent Vice President Richard Nixon. Nixon was something of a seasoned politician, and had spent his entire life configuring his image in that light. He was a Navy veteran, an attorney, and a renowned scholar. He had served an impressive 8 years as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, and had become known for his tough attitude towards communism and exceptional debating skill. On this stage, however, he presented none of that resilience, and instead appeared tired, ill, and anxious. To understand the image that 70 million Americans saw that day, we first need to review how each candidate prepared for the debate. An article titled, "At the First Kennedy-Nixon Debate, Presidential Politics Entered a New Era," describes the preceding days of both politicians in detail. Quote, knowing that his face would be beamed to millions of black and white TV sets, JFK also took a long nap and worked on his tan on the roof of the Chicago hotel. When Kennedy finally arrived at CBS Studios on the evening of September 26th, he was rested and ready for action. Even Richard Nixon later wrote that, "I had never seen him looking so fit." The same could not be said of Nixon. The sitting vice president had run himself ragged trying to fulfill a campaign promise to visit all 50 states, and had recently spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital after banging his knee on a door and contracting a staph infection. He showed up at the debate with a 102-degree fever and a sore leg, having whacked his hurt knee a second time on his way into the building. Debate producer Don Hewitt would later say that the Republican candidate's pale complexion and gaunt face made him look like death warmed over. Nixon refused to cancel, however, saying that dropping out so late would make him look like a chicken, unquote. And so the debate would proceed that night.
And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party.
Pause. There are a few things that you should notice about this frame. Number one, Nixon is wearing an unflattering gray suit on a gray background, which vaguely looks like something out of a 2000s draft night photo shoot. Number two, which will become more apparent as the debate goes on, the vice president is sweating and licking his lips constantly as a result of his illness. And number three, what possibly stood out to most voters at the time, Nixon is looking up. Now, Kennedy and Nixon were nearly indistinguishable in height. Kennedy probably would have had maybe an inch on Nixon due to his hair, but the image of Richard constantly looking up at Kennedy, even despite this being a common habit for the vice president when he was deep in thought, was burned into the minds of 70 million Americans. Now, let's see how his competitor is doing.
We cannot turn the job over to anyone else. If the United States fails, then the whole cause of freedom fails. And I think it depends in great measure on what we do here in this country. The reason Franklin Roosevelt was a good neighbor in Latin America was because he was a good neighbor in the United States. Because they felt that the American society was moving again. I want us to recapture that image. I want people in Latin America and Africa and Asia to start to look to America to see how we're doing things.
Let's stop here. Again, there are a few things to take away from this clip. First, there are visibly many more studio lights on Kennedy than on Nixon. The Democratic candidate also wears a sleek, dark suit that accentuates his face while he speaks and rarely deviates from looking at the camera and viewers at home. But enough about looks. Let's listen to what Kennedy is saying.
This is a great country, but I think it could be a greater country. And this is a powerful country, but I think it could be a more powerful country. I'm not satisfied to have 50% of our steel mill capacity unused. I'm not satisfied when the United States had last year the lowest rate of economic growth of any major industrialized society in the world, because economic growth means strength and vitality. It means we're able to sustain our defenses. It means we're able to meet our commitments abroad. I'm not satisfied when we have over $9 billion worth of food, some of it rotting, even though there is a hungry world, and even though 4 million Americans wait every month for a food package from the government, which averages 5 cents a day per individual. I saw cases in West Virginia, here in the United States, where children took home part of their school lunch in order to feed their families, because I don't think we're meeting our obligations towards these Americans. I'm not satisfied when the Soviet Union is turning out twice as many scientists and engineers as we are. I'm not satisfied when many of our teachers are inadequately paid, or when our children go to school part-time shifts. I think we should have an educational system second to none.
Kennedy's advantage in this debate, as is the advantage of most new candidates in any presidential race, is that viewers already have an experience of what life is like under the incumbent's administration. They have no experience, however, of what life is like under a new candidate's administration. This allows him to pick apart any flaws or shortcomings of Nixon's leadership and promise a better solution without actually having to deliver on that solution or how it will be accomplished yet. But it is Kennedy's assertive delivery that convinces you that he'll be a promising candidate and a promising president. Let's look at how Nixon responds.
Is the United States standing still? Is it true that this administration, as Senator Kennedy has charged, has been an administration of retreat, of defeat, of stagnation? Is it true that, as far as this country is concerned, in the field of electric power, in all of the fields that he has mentioned, we have not been moving ahead? Well, we have a comparison that we can make. We have the record of the Truman administration of 7.5 years and the 7.5 years of the Eisenhower administration. When we compare these two records in the areas that Senator Kennedy has discussed tonight, I think we find that America has been moving ahead. Let's take schools. We have built more schools in these last 7.5 years than we built in the previous 7.5, for that matter, in the previous 20 years. Let's take hydroelectric power. We have developed more hydroelectric power in these 7.5 years than was developed in any previous administration in history. Let us take hospitals. We find that more have been built in this administration than in the previous administration. The same is true of highways. Let's put it in terms that all of us can understand. We often hear gross national product discussed, and in that respect, may I say that when we compare the growth in this administration with that of the previous administration, that then there was a total growth of 11% over 7 years. In this administration, there's been a total growth of 19% over 7 years. That shows that there's been more growth in this administration than in its predecessors. But let's not put it there. Let's put it in terms of the average family. What has happened to you? We find that your wages have gone up 5 times as much in the Eisenhower administration as they did in the Truman administration. What about the prices you pay? We find that the prices you pay went up 5 times as much in the Truman administration as they did in the Eisenhower administration. What's the net result of this? This means that the average family income went up 15% in the Eisenhower years as against 2% in the Truman years. Now, this is not standing still.
By many accounts, Nixon's responses during this debate exhibited his superiority as a politician. In an editorial published 2 days after the event, the Washington Post wrote, quote, "Of the two performances, Mr. Nixon's was probably the smoother. He's an accomplished debater with a professional polish, and he managed to convey the slightly patronizing air of a master instructing a pupil," unquote. Simply put, Richard Nixon's experience and wisdom gave him an advantage that was visible when you analyze just the words of both candidates. But of course, because of the televised nature of this debate, the outcome had a lot less to do with words than anyone could imagine. What Nixon didn't know when he agreed to debate Kennedy was that he was entering a new age of politics, one that we are much more familiar with today. Dominated by public image and controversy, indifferent about party policy and the validity of campaign promises, and when it came to public image, there was nary a more captivating candidate than JFK. He ran campaign commercials with catchy jingles and surprise cameos from other public figures, while Nixon's commercials were much more practical, displaying him repeatedly sitting in a chair and discussing prevalent issues. Kennedy was always smiling and laughing and socializing, whereas Nixon preferred to be more reserved and focused. In layman's terms, he was just socially unappealing. So even after Americans learned of the circumstances under which the vice president carried out the debate, even after Nixon's performances in the next 3 debates proved him by far the more promising leader, and even with the knowledge that Nixon had much more experience with the foreign and domestic issues that the nation was currently facing, they would vote against him. Nixon would go on to lose the popular vote by a slim margin of about 100,000 votes, and the electoral vote by over 80. On his way back to California, he would develop a justified bitterness and contempt for the American people, who had essentially rejected him because of pretty privilege. His indignation would only grow as he suffered an embarrassing loss to another Democratic candidate when running for governor of California in 1962. This is where he would lash out at the media and tell them they would not, quote, have Nixon to kick around anymore, unquote. For 6 years, his contempt would have the opportunity to grow into mass distrust. And when Nixon decided to make his political return in '68, he did so with so much malice and paranoia for the media that his decisions changed the landscape of American politics forever.
Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys!
We have yet to, and probably will never, recover from the effects that television and social media has had on American politics. Sure, they allow for increased political participation and give government officials a way to directly interact with their voters, but on the other hand, they create a political climate that's dominated by propaganda, scandal, and controversy. While I was writing the script for this video, a lot changed in our political landscape. Joe Biden decided to drop out of the 2024 presidential election and instead endorse Vice President Kamala Harris. Running mates were announced, and we had another presidential and a first vice presidential debate to reflect that change. While I do acknowledge that this will have a substantial change on how the candidates of this election are perceived, I do think this conversation about how the media has shaped our opinions on Biden and Trump is an important one to have. After all, much of the rhetoric surrounding Kamala Harris's bid for the presidency, good and bad, attempts to identify her as a product of the Biden administration. And also, I just don't want to change everything I wrote. So.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
The conversation that surrounded Biden's health during that first debate, despite what is already known about his opponent, is extremely reminiscent of the experiences that Nixon had during his campaign in 1960. I say reminiscent and not indistinguishable because the conflict then was that the circumstances were making Nixon appear old and sick, while today both of these candidates are definitely old and probably sick. However, the rhetoric that surrounded both Biden and Trump this year is extremely similar to what happened in 1960. Every discussion I had in the aftermath of 2024's initial presidential debate either had something to do with Joe's tendency to stumble through his sentences, or just stumble in general, Or, a little later, how many aura points Trump's post-assassination attempt fist pump earned him. While significant portions of the public are undoubtedly concerned about this country's most pressing issues, such as inflation, healthcare, and our foreign policy, media coverage seems to be overwhelmingly concerned with public image and big personalities. People who can make big, forceful promises and statements with no real intentions of delivering on them. Empty promises are kind of a politician's trademark, but we seem to be heading in a direction of increasing indifference to whether or not modern politicians even attempt to satisfy their promises. So if the promise of policy isn't the focus, how do politicians continue to intrigue voters? Trump's appeal, in my opinion, is predominantly public image. Donald Trump entered American politics as a flashy businessman, attracting most of his supporters through his inability to mince words and his fervent patriotic and nationalistic remarks. An article by the Scientific American highlights how Trump purposely builds his image in this light. Quote, "Likewise, the way Trump dresses, always immaculate in tie and expensive suit, never dressing down, signifying his wealth, the way he talks, the crude, undiplomatic forms of expression, and what he says are not incidental. They are part of his performance as an exemplary American. In addition, they distinguish him from the typical, or prototypical, politician. What was thought to be a weakness, lack of political experience, is touted as a strength. Here, then, Trump's constant violations of political rules, so often seen as presaging his decline, actually serve to consolidate his ascendancy." Unquote. Americans in rural environments or those with more traditionalist values tend to gravitate towards Trump's form of government because he distinguishes himself as one of us, the Americans, and not one of them, the lying, cheating, backstabbing politicians. Though undoubtedly dangerous in the way that he harnesses it, Trump's ability to appeal to the public through populist sentiments is kind of impressive. Conversely, Biden and even Harris often portray themselves as the lawful neutral to Trump's chaotic evil. They position themselves as these harbingers of political order and optimism that will save the nation from Trump and his evil plans to topple American democracy as we know it. The dynamic between both sides is almost cinematic, and the spectacle it creates is often amplified by the media and even the candidates themselves. It would be, and sadly often is, very entertaining if the thing being held in the balance wasn't the image of our entire country. We all engage in and contribute to this cycle, often at the expense of nuance, until we are forced to ask ourselves, are we voting for leaders or entertainers? As November 5th inches closer and closer, it's important for us, as viewers and as an audience, to acknowledge the leverage that television and social media has on our ability to form our own opinions. Think about what you believe about our current presidential candidates. How much of it is based on actual policy, leadership, or experience? How much of it is shaped by viral sound bites, memes, sensational headlines? And of course, it is perfectly fine for us to enjoy media that may poke fun at a certain political candidate. However, when we make this a habit, this cycle of shallow analysis often forces us to sacrifice everything of substance and instead opt for what is only visually compelling. So as you go out to vote, advocate for, or speak out against any candidate, I urge you to consider, are you seeing them for who they are, or for who they are manufactured to be? And how much power are you willing to give to the platforms that profit off of your attention?
I would like to take this opportunity to express my fondness for Duff beer.
I'd also like to express my fondness for that particular beer.